How did your parents' obsession ruin your life? We're going to try out for the amazing race next season, and you need to start training immediately, my dad said, bursting into my office. I already told everyone we're going to win $1 million together. Dad, I work 60 hours a week and have never watched that show, I said. That's why I brought you training equipment, he said, dumping out rope, carabiners, and a machete. We start practicing eating gross foods tonight because I'm not losing our audition because you can't stomach sheep eyeballs. I'm not eating sheep eyeballs with you, I said. You're my only child and this is my dying wish, he said, even though he was perfectly healthy. Either you apply with me, or I'll tell everyone you abandoned your father's dream. My client left without signing the contract. 3 weeks later, he hired a reality TV consultant to coach us on creating the perfect Amazing Race audition tape, even though I'd never agreed to apply. He rented a film crew and staged fake challenges in our hometown, making me race him through the grocery store while he screamed about our father-son bond to confused shoppers. He submitted the application without my signature by forging it, then sued me for breach of verbal contract when I refused to participate. The lawsuit claimed I'd promised him a televised adventure and was destroying his mental health. He got us on the local news as the father-son team torn apart by amazing race dreams, telling reporters I was too ashamed of him to be seen on television. CBS sent a rejection letter, but he claimed they'd change their minds if we proved ourselves through a practice run. After months of training alone, he created his own amazing race in our neighborhood to film as a supplemental audition video. He'd mapped 12 challenges across town and invited hundreds to watch us compete against imaginary teams, narrating our progress through a megaphone strapped to his head. He made us eat raw fish at the Japanese restaurant while screaming we were falling behind, then forced me to carry him through the park for a traditional bonding challenge. When I tried to quit at the rock climbing wall, he climbed without a harness to prove we deserved to be on the show. He fell 30 feet and shattered his pelvis, but kept crawling toward the next challenge, screaming that CBS would see our dedication. Instead of going to the hospital, he injected himself with black market steroids and painkillers to finish his audition video. He zip-lined across the river on a cable he'd illegally installed between buildings, but his broken pelvis made him lose his grip, and he fell into the water and got swept into the dam machinery. He got pulled through the turbine, and it shredded his left leg so badly they had to amputate below the knee, but he was conscious the whole time, screaming we were still going to make it to the pit stop. He dragged himself out and hopped on one leg to the final challenge at City Hall, which was eating a gallon of cottage cheese while solving a puzzle about our family history. He went into anaphylactic shock because he'd developed a severe dairy allergy from the steroids, and his throat closed up, but he kept trying to swallow while his face turned purple. He gave himself an emergency tracheotomy with a ballpoint pen to keep breathing, and finished the cottage cheese through his neck hole, then collapsed at the finish line holding a homemade trophy that said, "Future Amazing Race Champions. You cost me my leg because you wouldn't just try out for the show with me," he said from his hospital bed where they were fitting him for a prosthetic. "If you'd been a good son and agreed to audition with me, I'd still be able to walk." "Dad, CBS never even called us back," I said, but my mom turned away from me in disgust. "He'll never run again because you were too selfish to spend quality time with your father pursuing his dream," she said, while he sobbed about never getting to race around the world. The city was suing me for the illegal obstacles he'd built because he'd listed me as co-organizer on all the permits, and the dam company wanted $3 million for the damage his body did to their turbine. My mom moved my dad into my apartment because she said I owed him 24-hour care after stealing his leg, and she threw out all my belongings to make room for his physical therapy equipment. I slept on the floor for 3 months, while my dad lay in my bed dictating new Amazing Race application essays about our inspiring story of overcoming adversity, making me write down how losing his leg only made our father-son bond stronger. He told everyone who visited that we were going to win next season because no other team had a story like ours, and when I tried to leave for work, he called the police saying I was abandoning a disabled person who depended on me for survival. "We're going to be the first amputee team to win," he said, while I changed his bandages for the 5th time that day. The bandage stuck to the dried blood on his stump, and he winced as I peeled it away. That night, I tried sleeping on the hardwood floor next to my own bed, while he sprawled across my mattress practicing his victory speech for when we won the $1 million. My spine pressed against the wood planks, and every time I shifted position, a board creaked loud enough to wake him. He'd sit up and start reciting how we overcame adversity through father-son teamwork, and I'd lay there staring at the ceiling fan, knowing I'd get maybe 2 hours of broken sleep before my alarm went off for work. Around 2 a.m., he turned on the bedside lamp and read his speech out loud for the 20th time that night. The next evening, I stepped outside to grab the mail from the box at the end of our hallway, and within 3 minutes, heard sirens approaching. 2 cops showed up at my door saying they'd received another welfare check call about an abandoned, disabled person in immediate danger. The officers looked exhausted, and one of them rubbed his forehead while asking if everything was okay. Dad wheeled himself to the doorway, crying about how I'd left him alone without his medication, even though his pills were sitting right on the nightstand. They had to follow protocol and check his vitals while he sobbed about being neglected by his only son. After they left, I found 17 missed calls on my phone from a longtime client who'd seen the local news segment about the son who cost his father a leg. He said he couldn't work with someone who'd abandoned family and terminated our contract effective immediately. My monthly income dropped by $2,000, and I calculated how many more clients I could lose before missing rent. The certified letter arrived the next morning requiring a signature, and my hand shook as I signed for it. Inside were 2 separate documents with numbers that made my stomach drop. The dam company wanted $3 million in turbine repairs, plus environmental cleanup costs. The city demanded $70,000 for removing illegal zip lines and obstacle course equipment Dad had installed across 12 locations. They'd frozen my bank accounts pending investigation since he'd listed me as co-organizer on every permit application. Mom showed up that afternoon with a U-Haul full of parallel bars and resistance bands. She pushed past me, dragging metal equipment through my living room, and started dismantling my desk to make space. She threw my computer monitors in a box and shoved my work files into garbage bags, while telling me I should be grateful Dad still wanted me as his amazing race partner after I'd destroyed his body. The parallel bars scraped deep gouges in my hardwood floor as she assembled them where my workspace used to be. That night, after Dad finally passed out from his pain medication, I sat on the bathroom floor with a flashlight going through every document he'd created. Bank statements showed he'd opened credit cards in my name to fund his training equipment. Permit applications had my forged signature authorizing construction of climbing walls on public buildings. Medical forms claimed I was his primary caregiver requesting experimental treatments. The stack of fraudulent paperwork grew 3 inches thick, and I photographed every page with my phone. Before sunrise, I opened my laptop in the bathroom and searched for civil attorneys who handled identity theft and fraud cases. My fingers trembled, typing out inquiry emails explaining how my dad had forged my signature on amazing race applications and city permits. I attached the photographed evidence and hit send on 7 different law firm contact forms, knowing this would destroy whatever relationship remained with my parents. 2 days later, my phone rang with a blocked number, and a woman's calm voice introduced herself as Josephine Eckert from Eckert and Associates. She'd reviewed my documentation and wanted to meet immediately about defending against the lawsuits. Her voice sounded professional and steady, which felt like finding solid ground after months of chaos. We scheduled a consultation for the next morning at her downtown office. Dad must have sensed something changing because he started dictating a new amazing race application essay about our inspiring journey of recovery. He made me sit at the kitchen table with a legal pad while he described how losing his leg had strengthened our bond and prepared us for any challenge the show could present. When I stopped writing after 10 minutes, he grabbed his phone, threatening to call Adult Protective Services and report elder abuse. The guilt hit, even though I knew it was manipulation, and I kept writing his delusional fantasy about us racing through airports with his prosthetic leg. The next morning, I told him I had a work meeting and drove to Josephine's office in a glass tower downtown. She had short gray hair and wore a navy suit that looked more expensive than my car. Her conference room had a view of the river where Dad had destroyed his leg in the dam turbine. She'd already pulled public records showing Dad's pattern of fraud going back 3 years before the amazing race obsession started. She explained how we could file countersuits for identity theft and establish that I was a victim, not a co-conspirator. She showed me precedents where adult children weren't held liable for parents' illegal actions even when signatures appeared on documents. For the first time in months, someone looked at me without disgust or disappointment. She outlined a legal strategy to separate my liability from Dad's actions and protect my remaining assets. Her paralegal had already drafted cease and desist letters for the false emergency calls and harassment. She said we could likely get the city fines reduced to $10,000 if I cooperated fully with removal crews. The dam company would be harder, but she thought we could prove I had no involvement in the actual installation or Dad's decision to zipline into the turbine. That afternoon, I drove back to my apartment and found Mom sitting on the couch watching Dad do arm exercises with resistance bands he'd attached to my doorframe. She looked up when I walked in, and I knew I had to try talking to her about setting some basic limits on this whole situation. I sat down next to her, and started explaining how I needed to keep my job to pay for everything, including Dad's medical bills and the apartment. She turned away from me and started crying about how she must have failed as a mother to raise such a selfish son who valued money over family. Her shoulders shook as she said she never thought her own child would abandon his father when he needed us most. Dad stopped his exercises to watch, and I saw him smile behind her back while she sobbed about family values and how disappointed she was in me. The guilt hit me hard even though I knew what they were doing, and I ended up apologizing and promising to do better. 2 days later, I called Josephine's office, and her assistant gave me a referral for a therapist named Kira Huang, who specialized in family trauma and boundary issues. I made an appointment for the following week and felt both relieved and guilty about needing professional help to deal with my own parents. The next morning, Dad wheeled himself into the kitchen, holding a container of raw oysters from the seafood market down the street. He said we needed to practice eating gross foods for the amazing race, and these would simulate sheep eyeballs perfectly. I looked at the slimy gray oysters floating in their juice and told him I wasn't doing this anymore. He started yelling about commitment and dedication, but I grabbed my keys and walked out of my own apartment for the first time in weeks. I drove around for an hour just breathing and feeling proud of myself for saying no, even though my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My phone rang, and Reed Barron's name appeared on the screen, making my stomach drop, because I knew what this call would be about. He told me my missed deadlines and the public drama from Dad's news appearances were putting my position at serious risk. He said the partners had noticed my declining performance, and if things didn't improve immediately, I'd be facing termination proceedings. I pulled over in a parking lot and put my head on the steering wheel, trying not to panic about losing my only source of income. 3 days passed before Josephine's office sent out the cease and desist letters to Dad regarding the forged signatures and false police reports. She emailed me copies, and I read them over and over, feeling both hopeful and terrified about what would happen when Dad received his. The certified mail arrived 2 days later, and I watched from the kitchen as Dad signed for it and tore open the envelope. His face turned red as he read, and then he grabbed his phone and started recording himself in his wheelchair. He posted a 20-minute video calling me a dream killer who was trying to destroy his amazing race dreams with lawyers and threats. Within hours, my email and social media inboxes filled with messages from strangers calling me heartless and evil for abandoning my disabled father. People I'd never met were sharing Dad's video and adding their own comments about what a terrible son I was. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications until I had to turn it off completely just to think straight. The therapy appointment with Kira came 4 days later, and I sat in her small office with plants everywhere and soft lighting that made me feel calmer. She listened without judgment as I explained everything from the beginning and helped me identify my triggers and guilt patterns. She gave me a journal and showed me how to write down facts versus the guilt-based thoughts that kept spinning in my head. She said what was happening wasn't normal and validated that this was actually emotional abuse, even though it was hard to accept. I left feeling both relieved that someone understood and scared about what accepting that truth meant for my family relationships. The next day, an official notice arrived from the city about the administrative hearing for Dad's illegal obstacle course installations throughout town. The hearing date was set for 3 weeks away, and the fines listed made my eyes water, even though they were just estimates. I knew I had to show up and cooperate fully if I wanted any chance of reducing the penalties. I spent the next morning researching home healthcare services and found a company that could send someone 4 hours a day to help with Dad's care. I scheduled an assessment visit and felt hopeful about getting some of my life back with professional help. Mom found out about it 2 days later and called the company to cancel everything, saying family takes care of family and strangers weren't welcome. She threw away the business card I'd hidden in my dresser and told Dad I was trying to abandon him to strangers. Another week passed before the police showed up again at 11:30 at night for yet another welfare check. This time I had copies of Josephine's cease and desist order ready and showed them along with my detailed care logs from the past 3 months. The officers took photos of the documents, and one of them pulled me aside in the hallway. He mentioned quietly that Adult Protective Services might need to get involved if this pattern continued and gave me a business card with a case number. I nodded and put the card in my wallet, knowing this was getting bigger than just family drama. 3 days later, Josephine called me at work and said she'd filed motions to dismiss Dad's lawsuit against me and started discovery requests for all his medical records from the hospital. She needed documentation showing his mental state during treatment and wanted records of every surgery and medication they'd given him since the accident. I printed out copies of everything she sent and felt the stack of papers getting thicker with each court filing she submitted. The legal fees were adding up, but she said dismissing his lawsuit would save me more money than fighting it in court for months. That same afternoon, Mom showed up at my office with a photo album from my childhood and started flipping through pages showing every birthday party and Christmas morning they'd given me. She pointed at pictures of Dad teaching me to ride a bike and taking me to baseball games and asked how I could abandon someone who'd spent 20 years raising me. My co-workers watched through the glass walls as she cried about all the sacrifices they'd made sending me to college and supporting my dreams. She left the album on my desk with sticky notes marking every photo where Dad was helping me with homework or cheering at my graduation. Curtis K. called from the hospital 2 days later about a rehab facility that had an opening for Dad but needed parental consent for the placement. I put him on speaker while Mom stood in my apartment, shaking her head and telling him family doesn't send family away to institutions. Curtis suggested I document her refusal in writing and said he'd note it in Dad's file for future reference if things got worse. Mom grabbed the phone and hung up on him, then deleted his number from my contacts list. The next morning, Dad was going through his usual amazing race victory speech about how we'd overcome adversity together when he started talking about the permit applications. He went into detail about copying my signature from old documents and practicing until he could forge it perfectly for the obstacle course permits. I turned on my phone's voice recorder and let it run for 20 minutes while he explained every document he'd forged with my name. He even showed me the practice sheets where he'd copied my signature hundreds of times to get it right. Pavel Rutledge from the city met me at the first illegal zip-line installation the following week, with a clipboard and camera to document everything. We walked to 14 different sites where Dad had built obstacles without permits, or with forged documents listing me as co-applicant. Pavel took photos of every cable, platform, and climbing hold Dad had drilled into buildings and trees throughout downtown. I signed statements confirming I hadn't authorized any of the installations and agreed to help remove them at my own expense. The embarrassment of having a city official photograph my dad's crazy, amazing race course made my face burn, but I needed the documentation. That weekend, I discovered Dad had created a GoFundMe page using my professional headshot from the company website, claiming I was refusing to help Tammy disabled father. The page had already raised $4,000 from strangers who'd seen his videos about our amazing race dream being destroyed. I screenshot everything and filed a fraud report with the platform, then called my bank to make sure he couldn't access my accounts. The GoFundMe got taken down within 48 hours, but not before Dad posted another video calling me heartless. A thick envelope from the dam company arrived the next Monday with mediation dates and a notice that Gabriella Hubbard would be handling the settlement conference. The paperwork said both parties needed to attend with legal counsel and bring all documentation related to the turbine damage incident. The dates were set for 6 weeks away and included 3 full days of mediation sessions to determine liability. Reading through the technical reports about turbine repair costs made my hands shake because even 10% liability would bankrupt me. Reed called me into his office that Thursday and said he was reassigning the green project to another team lead because of my attendance issues. The project was worth $200,000 in commissions that I desperately needed for legal fees, but he couldn't trust me to meet deadlines anymore. He showed me emails from clients complaining about my missed meetings and said one more incident would mean termination. I nodded and handed over the project files, knowing my income just dropped by 60%. My session with Kira that week focused on practicing what to say when setting boundaries with my parents. She had me write out scripts for different situations, and we role-played how to stay calm when they pushed back. We created a safety plan with specific steps for leaving the apartment, including where I'd go and what I'd take with me. She helped me pack a bag with important documents and clothes that I kept in my car trunk just in case. The following Saturday, Dad suddenly fell out of his wheelchair screaming that his stump was infected and needed emergency treatment immediately. Mom called 911 and rode with him in the ambulance while I followed in my car to the hospital. The ER doctor examined him for 2 hours and ran blood tests that all came back normal with no sign of infection. Dad kept insisting something was wrong, but the doctor found nothing and suggested this might be attention-seeking behavior. I added the false emergency report to my growing documentation file and felt disgust instead of the guilt that used to consume me. 2 days later, a man in a gray suit knocked on my door and showed me his Adult Protective Services badge with the name Nolan Parker printed below his photo. He said they'd received an anonymous report about elder neglect and needed to investigate the living situation immediately. I let him in and watched him take photos of Dad's therapy equipment filling every corner while Dad wheeled himself out demanding to know who called the government on his family. Nolan asked Dad about his care routine, and Dad started ranting about how I was trying to destroy his amazing race dreams by refusing to train with him anymore. I pulled out my 3-inch binder of documentation and handed it to Nolan, showing him every forged signature, false police report, and medical record from Dad's self-inflicted injuries. Nolan flipped through the pages taking notes while Dad kept interrupting to explain that losing his leg was my fault for not being a supportive son. The investigator spent 2 hours reviewing everything and interviewing us separately, asking Dad specific questions about his daily care that Dad couldn't answer consistently. When Nolan asked about the false emergency calls, Dad admitted he only called 911 to keep me from abandoning him at work. The investigator wrote that down word for word and told me he'd be in touch about his findings within the week. The next morning, Josephine called me to her office to prepare for the upcoming deposition in Dad's lawsuit against me. She spread out legal documents across her conference table and taught me how to answer questions without giving the opposing counsel ammunition. We practiced for 3 hours with her firing rapid questions while I learned to stick to simple facts and avoid emotional responses. She showed me how to say, "I don't recall," instead of guessing, and how to pause before answering to give her time to object if needed. The discipline of controlling my words felt strange after months of emotional chaos with my parents screaming accusations at me daily. She reminded me that everything I said would be recorded and could be used against me in court, so precision mattered more than defending myself. That afternoon, my landlord slipped an eviction notice under my door, citing multiple lease violations, including unauthorized occupants and alterations to the apartment. The notice listed the therapy equipment bolted to walls, the parallel bars blocking the hallway, and Dad living there without being on the lease. I had 30 days to fix the violations or face eviction proceedings, adding housing insecurity to my growing pile of problems. The thought of being homeless while dealing with lawsuits and Dad's care made my chest tight with panic. I called the landlord to explain the situation, but he said other tenants were complaining about the noise from Dad's late-night Amazing Race training videos. That weekend, I typed up a detailed care schedule with specific hours for meals, medication, and therapy exercises. I printed it on bright yellow paper and taped it to the fridge as non-negotiable ground rules for Dad's care routine. The schedule blocked out my work hours as completely unavailable and designated specific times when I'd help with his needs. Dad ripped it down immediately, but I printed 10 copies and kept putting them back up every time he destroyed one. Mom called me selfish for creating boundaries, but I kept replacing the schedule and pointing to it when they demanded help outside the designated times. 3 days later, Dad called 911 at 2 p.m., claiming severe chest pains that required immediate transport to the emergency room. The paramedics arrived and found his vitals completely normal, but took him anyway because chest pain complaints required automatic transport. At the hospital, Dad told the doctor I'd been neglecting him, but when Nolan Parker showed up to investigate, Dad admitted he'd lied about the chest pain. He told Nolan he just wanted to stop me from going to work, because he needed someone to watch his new Amazing Race training video. Nolan documented the false emergency call and noted a pattern of coercive control in his report, adding it to the growing case file. The emergency hearing for a harassment prevention order happened 2 weeks later, in a small courtroom with a judge who looked exhausted before we even started. Josephine presented evidence of Dad's false emergency calls, forged signatures, and public defamation campaign against me. The judge reviewed the thick stack of documentation while Dad insisted from his wheelchair that everything he did was motivated by love for his son. After 40 minutes of testimony, the judge granted a temporary order limiting Dad's ability to make false emergency calls about me. The order was narrow and only addressed the 9/11 abuse, but it was the first legal protection I'd gotten in this mess. The city hearing about the illegal obstacles happened the following Tuesday, with Pavel Rutledge presenting photos of every zip line, rope course, and obstacle Dad had installed without permits. The city attorney wanted $50,000 in fines, plus immediate removal of all installations at my expense, since Dad had listed me as co-organizer. Pavel negotiated with the hearing officer, explaining that I was cooperating fully and had been a victim of identity fraud in the permit applications. After 2 hours of back and forth, they agreed to reduce the fines to $25,000 if I hired licensed contractors to remove everything within 60 days. It was still money I didn't have, but better than the original penalty that would have destroyed me completely. That night, Mom called and said I'd never see them again if I continued attacking Dad with lawyers and courts. She said I was dead to her for choosing legal action over family loyalty, and that no judge could force them to love me. The grief hit harder than expected, because even though they'd been awful, losing the fantasy of someday having normal parents hurt deeply. I sat in my car after the call and cried for the parents I'd never actually had, while knowing I couldn't stop the legal protections I desperately needed. 2 days later, Gabriella sent a USB drive with security footage from the dam showing Dad going through the turbine machinery. I made the mistake of watching it and saw his body getting pulled through the spinning blades while he screamed about making it to the pit stop. The video triggered immediate panic attacks with my heart racing and hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold my phone steady. I called Kira for an emergency session and drove to her office while playing breathing exercises on repeat to keep from hyperventilating. She spent 90 minutes helping me ground myself using specific techniques to separate Dad's choices from my responsibility for his injuries. We practiced breathing exercises where I counted to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale while naming things I could see, hear, and touch in her office. The panic slowly receded enough for me to function, though the image of Dad in that turbine would haunt me for months afterward. Josephine called the next morning with good news about our case. She'd driven to the Japanese restaurant where Dad made us eat raw fish and got the owner to sign a sworn statement about what happened that day. The owner wrote down everything about Dad screaming, we were falling behind imaginary teams, and forcing me to eat faster while customers left in disgust. Then Josephine went to the climbing gym and got their statement too, about Dad climbing without safety gear and how they'd tried to stop him before he fell. The gym owner had security footage of Dad refusing their help and pushing past staff to climb the wall anyway. These statements proved Dad created dangerous situations on his own, and I wasn't responsible for his choices. Nolan called that afternoon about Dad's case review and said the rehab facility had a bed available if we could get him admitted. The problem was, Mom had to agree since she was his medical proxy, and she kept saying, family takes care of family. Nolan explained that professional care would be better for Dad's recovery, but Mom hung up on him when he suggested it. I spent the rest of the day writing a certified letter to both parents with my final decision. The letter said Dad had 30 days to go to rehab, or I was moving out no matter what Mom said about family duty. I made it clear this wasn't a negotiation, and included copies of all the legal documents showing why I couldn't keep living like this. The post office gave me tracking confirmation and said it would be delivered in 2 days with signature required. That night, Dad set up his phone on the kitchen counter and started live streaming himself, wheeling around the apartment, doing what he called practice races. He rolled from room to room, timing himself, while narrating to his viewers about how his son was trying to destroy his amazing race dreams. Every few minutes he'd point the camera at me and call me a traitor for hiring lawyers instead of helping him train. I stayed in the bathroom with the door locked while he streamed for 3 hours, telling strangers I was the worst son in America. The next week, Gabriella scheduled our dam company mediation at the courthouse downtown. She'd reviewed all the evidence, including the turbine footage and Dad's medical records from that day. During the 4-hour session, she explained how the investigation showed Dad installed the illegal zip line alone and chose to use it despite his injuries. The dam company's lawyer agreed Dad bore primary responsibility since he trespassed on their property and ignored warning signs. They reduced my liability to just administrative fines for not reporting the illegal installation sooner, even though I didn't know about it. The total came to $30,000 instead of $3 million, which was still awful, but wouldn't destroy my entire future. Reed called me into his office the day after mediation with a typed warning letter on official company letterhead. He said I'd missed too many deadlines and client meetings over the past months, and this was my final chance. One more absence or missed deadline would mean immediate termination, with no severance or recommendation. I signed the warning acknowledgement knowing my job was hanging by a thread, but it was literally my only income. That weekend, I drove to 5 different apartment complexes, looking for the cheapest place I could afford on my damaged credit. I found a tiny studio above a pizza shop for $800 a month, with move-in special of just first month's rent. The landlord ran my credit and approved me with a co-signer requirement, but I signed anyway and got the keys. I sent another certified letter to my parents with my move-out date in 2 weeks, and the address where they could reach me for emergencies only. Dad's response was to wheel himself out to the sidewalk the next morning with his phone streaming and threatened to roll into traffic if I abandoned him. He sat at the curb crying about how I was killing him by leaving while cars honked and swerved around his wheelchair. A viewer must have called 911 because 3 police cars showed up within minutes and found Dad blocking traffic on purpose. The officers recognized him from all the false emergency calls, and one wrote in his report about the clear manipulation pattern. They made Dad go back inside and warned him about endangering himself for attention, but he kept screaming, I was murdering him by moving out. Josephine filed emergency paperwork that afternoon to expand the harassment prevention order based on Dad's escalating behavior. She also moved to dismiss Dad's lawsuit against me entirely with prejudice, which means he couldn't file it again later. The hearing got scheduled for next month, and she said the judge would probably grant both requests, given all our evidence. She attached Dad's livestream videos as exhibits, showing him admitting to false emergencies and deliberate manipulation. Nolan closed his investigation the following week after interviewing both my parents and reviewing my care documentation. He found no evidence of neglect, since I'd been providing 24-hour care for months, despite the abuse. His report cleared me completely, but he gave me a list of vetted home health agencies that could take over when I moved. He said these agencies were used to difficult patients and would document everything to protect themselves legally. The validation felt good, even though nothing really changed with my parents refusing outside help. 3 weeks later at the mediation, Gabriella laid out all the damage reports and repair estimates on the conference table. The turbine company's lawyers had folders 3 inches thick with photos of Dad's body getting pulled through the machinery. They played security footage showing him falling from his illegal zip line into the dam's intake area. Dad's lawyer kept trying to argue I was equally responsible since my name was on some permits he'd forged. Gabriella reviewed each document and pointed out the obvious forgery marks where Dad had traced my signature. The turbine company wanted someone to pay for their damaged equipment and lost operating time. After 6 hours of back and forth, they agreed Dad was primarily liable for the damage since he'd installed the illegal cable himself. My portion came down to $30,000 in administrative fees and partial repair costs. It wasn't the $3 million they'd threatened, but it was still more money than I had. Pavel from the city met with me the next day about removing all the illegal obstacles Dad had built. He showed me photos of the zip line cables still hanging between buildings and the climbing holds drilled into the library wall. The removal estimates came to $15,000 for licensed contractors to safely take everything down. Pavel said the city would cut the fines in half if I got everything removed within 60 days. I signed the agreement and called 3 removal companies that afternoon to get quotes. The cheapest one could start next week for $12,000 with a payment plan over 6 months. While I was dealing with contractors, Curtis called from the hospital with unexpected news about Dad's insurance. They'd approved a rehab bed at a facility 20 minutes away that specialized in difficult patients. Mom didn't want Dad going to what she called a nursing home for broken people. Curtis suggested we frame it differently when talking to her about the placement. That evening I went to the apartment and told Mom the insurance had gotten Dad into an elite training facility. She perked up at the word elite and asked if it would help him prepare for next year's amazing race. I said yes, because it was easier than arguing, and she finally agreed to the transfer. The facility had an opening in 4 days, which gave us time to pack Dad's medications and therapy equipment. Transfer day arrived, and Dad started screaming the moment the medical transport showed up. He called me a traitor and said I was dumping him in a prison because I couldn't handle taking care of family. The transport team had dealt with resistant patients before and strapped him to the gurney while he thrashed around. I handed the intake nurse a binder with all his medical records and care logs I'd been keeping for months. She flipped through the documentation and said they'd seen situations like this before with family dynamics. Dad kept yelling that I'd stolen his dream, and now I was stealing his freedom too. The transport van pulled away, and I stood in the empty apartment looking at the parallel bars still bolted to my floor. That afternoon, I went to my phone settings and blocked Dad's number along with Mom's and all their friends who'd been harassing me. I sent the facility a written notice that all communication should go through their staff during business hours only. The facility director called to confirm they'd received my parameters and would enforce them strictly. Moving into my studio that night felt strange after months of sleeping on the floor. The space was tiny with just a bed and tiny kitchen, but it was completely mine. Sirens wailed outside from the fire station down the street, but I didn't care about the noise. I spread out on the bed and slept 6 straight hours for the first time since Dad's accident. My bones ached from exhaustion, but the relief of having my own space made everything else bearable. Reed called me into his office Monday morning to discuss my performance improvement plan. I'd been meeting deadlines again for 2 weeks straight, and he said he was seeing positive changes. One of the clients I'd lost even called, asking if I could take on a small project for them. I accepted immediately and promised to deliver on time, which I actually could now, without daily emergencies. Kira and I kept meeting weekly to work through the guilt and trauma of everything that had happened. She helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't abandoning family, but protecting myself from abuse. I started visiting Dad at the rehab facility once a week, with a staff member present to document the interaction. He'd calmed down somewhat on proper medications, but still talked about amazing race applications constantly. The visits lasted exactly 30 minutes, and I left when the timer went off regardless of what he was saying. 3 months passed with me slowly paying down the $30,000 debt through payment plans. I picked up extra freelance work on weekends to make the monthly minimums on everything. My relationship with my parents stayed broken, but I'd accepted that was the price of having my own life. The mess wasn't perfectly cleaned up, and probably never would be completely. Dad still told anyone who'd listen that I'd cost him $1 million and his leg. Mom still believed I'd failed as a son by not supporting Dad's dreams completely. But I had my apartment, and my job, and weekly therapy, and that was enough. Standing on solid ground felt better than drowning in their chaos, even if the ground was covered in debt. The obstacles were gone from around town, and the fines were slowly getting paid. My life wasn't great, but it was mine again, and that counted for everything. Man, thanks for hanging out and wondering about all these random questions with me today. Kinda wild, but fun. Sharing all these curious moments together. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.